morning.
Good morning.
This is my fourth talk, and what I've been doing, I guess in my own words, is just trying to draw together different aspects of the arts, and it's the way it crosses, the way it merges, dovetails with our practice, with Zen, with Buddhism in general. Today I'm going to talk about something I really have always felt like I don't know much about, which actually makes it kind of fun. But thinking about Zen and the arts, and maybe more broadly how our dance and Zen, and how our bodies project and hold Dharma. I realized that what I was using before, and I really love to go back to this book in Xerox form that Hoko has passed on to me. It has a lot of information, but sometimes it's kind of dry or stilted. It says that something is, and it doesn't feel as fluid as I think Zen should feel to me anyway. So in talking about dance, like I say, I really don't feel like I know very much about it. When I was an art student here in painting, it would be kind of a normal thing for my studio mates and myself break into spontaneous dance, because there was always rock and roll going on, there was always something going on. In that way it felt completely unconscious and available, and it felt like an honest expression for whatever it was. I guess the one comment that I want to bring up and kind of use as an introduction to this is to go back to that Xerox tome, and what I pulled from it is kind of a reiteration. Zen is present as self-expressive creative subject. So just talking about Zen and the arts in general, this I think speaks immediately to that. In other words, that which is expressing itself and that which is expressed are identical. And in dance, appearance and gestures of a person awakened. That is, the postures that appear as Zen expressed without one's body, or with one's body, excuse me. In other words, the formless self expressing itself. The formless self expressing itself. Okay, having said that, and maybe referring back to some of the recent talks on the Shobo Genzo, talking about time and space. Our bodies are time and space. Our bodies take up space. I feel like most of the time I'm not very conscious about where my body is and what it's doing. It gets me injured sometimes. My work is with my body. I'm a contractor, so having a solid stance on the floor and pushing a plane along, or a saw or anything, lifting things into place, being as precise as possible, it feels like a dance to me sometimes. At any rate, it requires that I kind of know where things are. There's a little spot in your brain, scientists have found, that actually keeps track of where we are in space all the time. In the same way that they find many of these things out, you injure that and all of a sudden you realize that you're not connecting. You're not realizing where you are physically in space and time. So there's an actual place in your brain that does this. I also want to think about how this body, as a vessel of Dharma, and then expressing itself, and how I do it. I guess I can draw comparisons. I think about in the early morning zazen, especially when I'm still sleepy and I'm waking up, I get up from my spot there and we move around the floor ready for Kin-Hin. And all of a sudden I realize my balance isn't very good. And I also realize there are parts of me that are hurting that weren't hurting while I was sitting. So it's kind of a bizarre thing to find myself all of a sudden focusing so much on where my feet are being placed and how I'm placing them. And then out the corner of my eye, I have Hosshin to look at, who always looks perfect. You know, he is here, he's like this, and so I'm trying to be as steady. In that way, it feels like a really impressive slow dance of sorts. About 10 years ago, I went to a Myo Shinji's version of Precepts Retreat, and there was a young gentleman there with severe cerebral palsy. I can't remember his name. He was a delightful guy. He was a poet. He was, with the help of the entire Sangha, sewing his rakusu. He was also playing the bells as best he could, and bowing as best he could, and all with this attitude of being very conscious in where he was and what he was doing, and also at the same time not wanting to interrupt everybody else's practice. He was wonderful to practice with. He was also a poet. He had some wonderful poetry, all his own. He ended up, last I knew, at the, Naropa's School of Disembodied Poetics. Does anybody know of that? But I was monitor for that particular Precepts Retreat, which meant that I got up in the morning and I went around, I rang a bell, and I got everybody else up. And I helped this young man by opening his door. That was the only thing I did for him. And he got himself out of bed and he crawled to the bathroom and took care of himself. This was, maybe 30 minutes before everybody else was getting up also. So I was so impressed with someone who's just dealing with life on his own terms and dealing with practice. And he clearly was fully engaged in what he was doing and fully engaged in the community there. And then on the other side of that, I remember watching a documentary about Merce Cunningham, the famous dancer, modern dancer. In his 90s, standing at the ballet bar and doing all these movements to the best of his ability of a 90-year-old, which is probably better than me at 64. So I thought it was pretty impressive. It's something so, I can't say it any other way, it was so embodied in him. He couldn't do anything but dance. I mean, not anything but dancing was so part of him and within his body memory. I would like to think that as my life goes on, I'm as able to remain devoted to the whatever talents I have, whatever direction I could go, however my body uses this life. And back when, in my early 20s, I did a stint with martial arts, practicing Aikido. And in my research around that, I think the Japanese developer of Aikido was a fellow named Takuan Soho. And he talks about how your practice is training the body so that the body and the mind, there's no separation there. That whatever the mind is doing, the mind flows through the body. So whatever actions are coming from your body are with the mind, they're all together. And it translates as that quickness where there's no gap between the thought and the action. And I don't think I ever got that down in my practice of Aikido, but I sure tried. A while back I was on YouTube looking at various things. Entertained occasionally by dance, and sometimes just really funny dance. But in scrolling through things, I saw something by Pilobolus. It's almost not dance, it's more of performance art, I guess you call it. But it looks very much like what I'm going to end up talking about, and that is Butto. It was developed in Japan. Butto is the dance of darkness. But Pilobolus, these amazing dancers, bodies painted white, mostly naked, making themselves move or move in concert with others that looked alien or looked like sea creatures, or I'm so taken by it that I've kind of been looking, and I keep looking for their different little performances. Then I discovered Butto. Actually, I'd heard about it because there's a woman that practices here sometimes who has done some Butto, Takahashi. And as much as I could talk with her about it, she has performed with a group in Japan, which kind of piqued my interest to find out what that was about at that time. So in a bizarre way, I think Butto is meditation and movement. It really looks like the intersection of performance art and dance. It has connections and roots in no theater and kabuki opera, both Japanese cultural arts. It seems to have arisen after World War II, from the ashes of World War II. People think of it, those who practice it, use it like a practice, like Zen, as a way of self-discovery. It is often performed with an audience, but it can be as well performed without an audience in the middle of a forest. It's movements are can be beautiful or grotesque, very theatrical. It can look like zombies. I guess my I think what really caught my interest in this is wondering why anybody would do this. I think I could see in general what the ideas about it were. But in digging about it deeper and reading a recent interview with a French woman who is a Butoh dancer. She lives in New York City and has a group that does Butoh in Brooklyn. She talks about it as a dance of death, something that I like to think we deal with here in our practice with Buddhism. It explores selflessness, transformation through changes in consciousness, and compassion. I think the expression of compassion comes out most powerfully in a kind of the way that it draws it from the viewer. And watching this dance, tortured beings, it just immediately evokes, starts to pull on me, that unconscious compassion for somebody suffering. There's actually a lot of literature out on this these days. Like I say, I'm completely new to it and just completely taken with it. And I think I'll find myself looking deeper into this, but most recently I read an article by Julia T. Crumps, who I think is is a dance critic, writes about dance. And trying to connect the Buddhist ethics of compassion to Butoh dance. She calls it as one who hears the cries. And I think I was talking about how this dance form kind of came out of the ashes of the Second World War. There were two founders of Butoh, original founders. The first fellow is Kazuo Ono. A comment by him is, on these mountains where no grass grows, searching for my thoughts in all the suffering, I myself became a ghost. I take his form and stretch out my hand to meet him. It doesn't matter what ghost, what matters is to reach him. This fellow died in the 90s, early 90s, I think. He was well into his 80s. He was still doing Butoh. He was also a prisoner of war during the Second World War. He saw his comrades die around him, saw a lot of death. And he pulls from that in embodying this expression. The other person is probably is the fellow that really is considered the founder and developer of this art. Tatsuwan Hijikata. He says, through dance we must depict the human posture in crisis. Then he goes on to say, when I begin to wish I were crippled, even though I am perfectly healthy, or rather that I would have been better off crippled. That is the first, I can't read my own writing here, first step forward towards Buddho. It's kind of a strange comment. As death is the theme in Buddho, you go back to the beginning, and Hijikata speaks about Buddho is a dead body, standing up and dancing with him. Of course, both of these gentlemen experienced in almost tactily direct ways the destruction of Hiroshima. It is written that Hijikata, who was the first, the founder, he was the fiery heart, and Ono was the soul of this form of dance. I think you could see it as a kind of postmodern dance. It was also developed in response to the European modernism. But it was also, because of that period of time, a way of revitalizing the Japanese art scene. So think in the early 50s. It borrows on German Expressionism and Romanticism and the films of W.F. Murnau, think of Nosferatu, and also Fritz Lang, think Metropolis. It's visually stunning, it's austere, it's has this kind of haunting theatricality. It doesn't embrace the classic beauty of the body as does ballet. As found a quote from a Sandra Freele, and she writes on Buddho, and referring back to ballet, some forms of dance purify movement through geometry and bodily sublimation, as in classical ballet, and its continuing influence in contemporary dance techniques. Buddho, however, does not purify and sublimate. It is muddy and often ugly, but it seems to understand that ugliness wakes up beauty. Ugliness wakes up beauty. The first performance of Buddho was in 1959. It was based on a Mishima novel called Forbidden Colors. And it describes the marriage of a gay man to a young woman. Descriptions of this are kind of horrifying, and I think it was scandalizing when it was performed. There's the sacrifice of a live chicken in it. I'd be interested to see this, or if anybody's seen this or actually seen anything about this or seen it performed since. Other things that have been said about this is the way that it connects to Zen, in my estimation, is there's a another Evangeline performance. It's called Piercing the Mask. And she talks about abandoning of the self, and that is the starting point of Buddho, a really active form of studying the self. It's been kind of hard to, I'm trying to, of course, develop my own thoughts around this, and looking at the performances as much as I could. There's a lot of stuff out there. And finding a connection between Zen and dance and Buddho. Saying that it's a practice, but I also think that, from what I can discern, people come to this, they're looking for stillness. But they're in this dance, it feels like it's a bald-faced confrontation with the emotions, as difficult as they are. It's not being averse to, the fear or the emotion you'd have facing your death or your decline in health, difficult relationships with people, the muddiness of our unconscious lives and our response to everything. When we sit here at the temple, we have a sesshin coming up. We're left sitting with ourselves, whatever comes up, whatever's there. Sometimes my mind gets really ugly, really troubled. I find myself wanting to crawl out of here sometimes, or just not face whatever my mind is surprising me with at whatever time. I think in the best form, that's what Buddho does. It's a kind of bold examination of yourself and some of the worst parts. But it's also letting go of it through movement. We let go of it through the passage of time here, just sitting. I thought it was kind of interesting that Evangeline in New York, this French woman who's teaching Buddho, teaches Buddho in prisons and schools. One of the things that she said about teaching it in prisons to prisoners is that they have little room for dishonesty. And of course you know that there had to have been some horrific suffering in their lives, horrific suffering that they've caused. I can see through movement, it would be quite an effective way of letting go. And watching her work with these prisoners is pretty amazing thing to watch. At this point in the history of Buddho, it is practiced more by non-Japanese than is Japanese. Evangeline's teacher was a Mexican master. She lived in Mexico for 5 years and practiced with him before moving on to New York. Well, I just want to say this form, it really affected me. I thought it was beautiful and really difficult to watch. I'm not going to say I'm a fanatic, but I'm interested in following up and looking at the other directions this goes. It inspired me enough to make me want to do it. I don't know if I'll go there, but and I guess I'd like to know at this point if there's any comment or any questions. Yes?
I remember my first year in college, I took a course in comparative world religion with Dr. Murphy. And he began his course by saying, before man thought religion, she danced. Which I found a very interesting way of starting it. So later, when I started going through the anthropological literature related to tribal religions, which I have a keen interest in, assuming the accuracy of the anthropological claims that the oldest cultures in the world would be the hunters and gatherers of Africa, then you can look at the Bushmen of southern Africa, and they have the trance dancing. So the trance dancing appears to be the oldest mode of religion. And dance seems to be a central feature of religion among tribal people, indigenous people across the planet. I've attended several sun dances, which is central to the religions of the Plains Indians. I was attending traditions from the Lakota, but there's also Cheyenne, Arapaho, Blackfoot, so forth. So the sun dance is their central, I guess you might say, high mass type of religion, very kinesthetic. It's also a way of giving sacrifice. So there's an element of suffering involved, because there's body piercing and hanging from the tree and so forth. The central motif of the tree of life. At the center of a circle, and the circle is a motif universal to religion, like the mandalas of Tibetan Buddhism, medicine wheel. And the circle is also a dynamic thing, so it itself is a dance. Like the icon of the dancing Shiva within the circle of fire, symbolic of life itself. Living among the Navajo, I've encountered what they call the Yebiche, which is it's almost the opposite of the sun dance in some way, because the sun dance is done in the summer during the day. The Yebiche is done in the winter months at night. And the central aspect of the dance is first the medicine man creating a sand mandala, and the dancers dressed as what they call kachinas, which are the deity forms. And so the song and dance move together in a rhythm which tells the story of the mandala. Then going over to the tantra, the same thing happens there. You have the monks create the sand mandala. You have other monks dressed in the deity forms, and they dance that energy, and that tantric energy is the energy of life, which also includes, much like in the sun dance, the energy of both the negative and the positive, the dark and the light, in a kind of a fusion where you draw upon the darkness, the pain, and the suffering to sublimate that into compassion and liberation from that suffering. So all that is also involved in the dance. Now in relation to Zen, Zen emerged out of Shaolin, which is also the place of Kung Fu. You mentioned Aikido. The three characters in Aikido, I, unification, Ki, or qi, energy, and then Tao or way, the way of the unification of energy, which comes with mind and body coming together into a conscious unity, kind of a direction. The same kind of thing going on in Tantra. So I think dance is very, very central to spirituality around the planet. So even when you're sitting still, your heart's beating, your breath is moving, your nerves are tingling, your body is in a state of dance, and you're being conscious of the dance. So there's no way not to dance when you're living in life. So I just wanted to add some commentary to what you're saying on this with respect to just how universal and important dance is to the whole of spirituality for all of humanity.
Yeah. You know, in reading some of the material about Buddha, they talked about the states that people would enter while doing it. Very much like a meditative state or a selfless state.
Like the trance dancing and the Bushmen, because they go into these altered states of consciousness, you might say, like Satari in form, but they have visions, and they say they see these luminous, like ropes or connections, and the connections are actually connections to deep ancestry. And when you follow the ropes, you follow these strings of luminosity, it brings you into the Great Spirit.
Mm-hmm. It's fascinating. Yes?
To add to that, I mean, Sufis also dance. It's a very essential part of their practice. Right? And then the stillness you are talking about, you know, they try to create the stillness by spinning. So the idea is that you spin, you forget your body, and you become as still as the eye of the hurricane in the middle. You take from the divine and you give it to the people.
Mm.
But I find it interesting that in your comments, crippling or death is like one way of trying to make the body still so you can be free from it. After World War II, that's interesting also that it's happened in Germany and Japan, two countries that lost the war. And it also shifted the art world from Europe to America, World War II, because the Europe was too traumatized. And the artist abandoned representational art because it was too triggering. So there were no people, no animals, it was just colors and shapes. Because they didn't want to remember. It was another way of getting rid of the body.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes?
So you've talked about painting, and you've talked about poetry, and now dance as expressions of Dharma. So I'm curious about what you see as the similarities and the differences across these kinds of art, about the Dharma they express, or how they express Dharma, because you can imagine, you know, poetry on a page, or maybe being read, you can imagine painting on a page, but you've also talked about the physicality of painting, and now we have dance. So what do you see as the similarities and differences about how those things are expressing Dharma, and what kind of Dharma they're expressing?
Jesus. I think they can't help but cross-refer, but you know, part of my struggle in doing these talks is how to draw some kind of a thread or a highway or something between all of these things and connect them. And I think it is that that point where the expression becomes selfless and formless. It's like in the first talk, I think it was the first talk I did, talking about painting and talking about Picasso or Cage, whoever, went into the studio, and eventually you slough off everything. Eventually you're left with yourself, and if you're lucky, you leave. And I think of the different things that I do, dance not being one of them really, but I've been there. Painting, poetry, my work, my construction, building things. When I'm not involved in it, when it is doing itself, there's that point when you step back and you feel that you have successfully come to that place. So that kind of meditation takes care of itself. And maybe that's the one thing that brought me to this kind of practice, is how to find that avenue without looking for it. Because when you're looking for it, you're self-conscious, or you're just noticing too much more than you need to notice. You know, not to get too pedestrian, but there's that connection where people in sports find the zone, and you know, people in one practice or another. It's that mindless, where the mind is there, but it's not there. There's that awareness. Boy, I don't know how to articulate that so much beyond just making a mess of it. So it's easy to draw that comparison. I think it's hard to draw the differences. To think about a literary form. What is in the mind with a literary form and poetry? What is in a physical movement form? And where's that connection? Where does all that dovetail? I mean, there is, of course, huge similarities, but how do you express that, or how do you think about that? So, I mean, one way to think about it is, of course, painting is a physical activity, but I'm responding to, as a painter, responding to what I'm visually looking at. It's automatic, and I stand back. Okay, so I'm living with that in that moment. Then I'm coming back to it, so there's another physical response to it. Sometimes I want to change it right then and there. I wish I had a set of paints with me. I could just go back into it and change it. But I'm also kind of done with it. Or realizing that, of course, you come back to every kind of art. If you do it enough, you come back with a different mind your entire life. And so there's always that childlikeness approach, and being open to the possibilities of it all. And then there's the maturity of how you develop it, and how it becomes truly an expressive language. So I don't know what else to say about it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
I'd like to respond to Hoko's question a little bit, and just to tell a little bit about me, which affected my thinking about the differences between the arts. All my training was as a musician, and then I got a teaching job where I was teaching music, as I had always done, but I was also appointed to teach art courses, and this was at the university level. And I'd never taken a college level art class at all, so it was really daunting. And I said, "Why do you want me to do this?" And they said, "Well, the people in the art school, you are making time-based art. And most of our students are not doing that, and we think they should do that more. And so no one in music would ever talk about music being a time-based art. It's just so obvious that no one really talks about that much as an aspect of music. But when you were talking about making paintings, talking about your creating paintings, it's something that happens in time. And just a couple minutes ago you were talking about looking at a painting you had made in the past and thinking of changing it and so on. So I have the sense that that painting for you is not really a static object. And you mentioned that each time you go back and look at it, it seems somewhat different, maybe, right? And so also I think when we experience a painting or a building, those are not, even though they are still objects, we experience them in time, right? Like if you showed me one of your paintings, I would be maybe first drawn to the top left corner and then the bottom right corner or whatever. I probably wouldn't be able to take it in all at once.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not sure that the split between time-based arts like music and dance, poetry, if read aloud, would fit in that too, I'm sure. I'm not sure that the split between time-based arts and static arts really holds. But in thinking about this, I remember something that Hosshin wrote. I forget which book it was in, but he was writing about going out into nature and listening to the sounds of nature and finding that especially engaging. And so listening to sounds, they're always changing and moving in time. Watching dance, I think, is like that. You're following something that's changing through time, even if it's a very minimal dance where there's almost no motion. And for me, that reminds me that of one of the things that I'm trying to grapple with in my practice, which is that everything is always changing. You know, we're always talking about impermanence and trying to accept that. So for me, the time-based arts are almost like a way of reaching that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's all I have to say right now. I'm sorry I talked so.
It kind of makes me think when I first started sitting, and it's somewhere I read about you should sit at the same time every day. It's kind of a good thing, because what happens is you see yourself change in those times. Up to that point, I sat, but it was mostly in fits and starts and whenever I felt like it. But if you just make a point to sit every single day at 6 in the morning till 7 in the morning, you'll notice more when you're alert and when you're together with it. You'll know when you're agitated. I mean, it's kind of that benchmark place. So I think what the arts do are kind of the same thing. In fact, when I was in school here painting, they talked about, making time to do what you do. Because the common thing was, well, I really didn't feel like painting, and you really understand that. Anything you do like that, I just didn't feel like it. Well, do it anyway, mess it up. You don't want to do it because you're afraid of messing up, or you're just afraid.
Mm.
But if you're afraid of, what are you afraid of? I mean, you know, I was afraid of messing up something I thought was really wonderful and precious.
Mhm.
Well, if you're thinking that way, maybe you need to mess it up. Just do it. Get rid of that preciousness and let the painting paint itself. So, and that's sort of, I mean, I can see the connection to practice, because just sitting, no matter how you feel, and paying attention to yourself and to your body, it's getting past that preciousness. It's not a big deal. You just do it. And that translates to life, because we still have to go out there and we still have to live our lives, no matter what comes at us. We can be walking down the street on a beautiful sunny day and some horrendous thing can happen right in front of you at any point. How do you deal with it? I mean, are you going to be ready for it? It's not like walk around, be ready for it, because that's all not. It's just, you're here with this whatever it is coming at you.
That makes me think of something else I wanted to mention, which was the other day I was fortunate to meet a man who is kind of famous at IU. His name is Tom Morris. Anybody know him? He's a strength and conditioning coach for some of the sports teams at IU. I think he's probably in his early 40s now. And in 2012, I believe it was, he already was in that job, and he was mountain biking, and he flipped over the handlebars and landed on his head, broke his neck, and he is paralyzed from his ribs down.
Yeah.
And his attitude is really amazing. He's doing racing with hand cycles and keeping his upper body strength and his attitude, you know, just really, really wonderful. And I know there was an injury like something like that in your own family. I don't know if you want to say anything about that, but the effect meeting him had on me over the past week, I'm really grateful for being able to walk around, and, you know, even if I have a lot of aches and pains, you know, but I'm more accepting of them, I think, than I was before meeting him. And so meeting him has really been important for me.
What you're referring to is my dad, when he was 54 years old, fell and broke his back and had a similar injury to the one you're talking about. So he spent the last third of his life in a wheelchair. And I think he ended up being a huge inspiration for me, just being able to watch how he dealt with it. And of course, when it's so close to you, you can really imagine it happening to yourself.
Right.
But he didn't give up. I mean, he probably lasted a whole lot longer than he should have, just because he had this attitude of not giving up. When he was a vital young man, you know, he was a couple 100 pounds, and he could move well, and he could climb, and he was big and powerful and impressive and scary. Mm-hmm. And after this, he became much less scary and much more engaging for me. I mean, he was much more of a father after the injury, because it was impatience that caused his injury. It was patience, learning patience, that changed him as a human being, because that's all he could do, was be patient with who he was and with everyone around him. And I remember watching him go into a hospital for some procedure, and some orderly thought he needed to come up and push my dad around.
Mhm.
My dad wouldn't have it. He took off on his chair and this guy was chasing him down the hall. So, you know, I mean, he still had an enthusiasm for life and an enthusiasm for the things he did. He was an inventor before he hurt himself.
Mhm.
He became more of an inventor because he started to invent things for himself that made his life easier. He made a chair, a mobile chair that would stand him up so he could work at a counter. He made a bed that would turn at various times so that it would take the pressure off the parts of his body to relieve the decubitus ulcers that most people in his condition get. So, I mean, there were scores of things like that that he did, and he sold the rights to them. And so he kept active with all that. It's great to see. Yeah.
Thank you for telling about that. I brought that up about Tom Morris and your dad because of thinking how our bodies, connected to dance and how we can express ourselves through our bodies and how the limitations of our bodies affect us also.
Yeah.
Not only physically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, just thinking about that philosophy, that intersection of space and time, and we are that. We're just that. So, at what point, how do we be that? Any other comments, questions?
Just like to comment how gratitude for being here today. I need to run, but I just wanted to say thank you. Nice meeting you all, and wish I could linger a little bit longer and be with you, but I do need to run right now.
Please come back.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Okay. Thank you.